On a February night in 2025, on the auction floor at Mecum in Las Vegas, a single motorcycle crossed the block and sold for $880,000. That is not a typo, almost 900 grand. For a bike built in a little shop in Los Angeles, mostly by hand, more than 80 years ago. And here is the strange part. When this motorcycle was brand new, almost nobody on Earth was allowed to buy one. The company that made it built barely more than 60 of them, and then it vanished. And it is far from alone. Because America didn't just build motorcycles. America helped turn the motorcycle from a backyard experiment into a full-blown industry. And then one by one, it let the greatest names in that industry die. This is a tour through the graveyard, and some of these machines should never have ended up here. Picture America in the early 1900s. The automobile is still a rich man's toy. The horse is on its way out. And the fastest, cheapest way for a working man to get across town under his own power is 2 wheels and an engine. So the country goes motorcycle crazy. At the peak, there were around 100 American motorcycle companies, not 100 models, 100 separate companies. Names like Pope, Thor, Reading Standard, Ivor Johnson, Flying Merkel, Cleveland, Ace, Yale, Emblem, and Militaire. A whole roaring ecosystem of American engineering, pouring out of factories from Massachusetts to California. And today, you can basically count what survived on one hand. Harley Davidson, and a version of Indian that had to be brought back from the dead decades later by a company best known for making snowmobiles. Everything else is gone. So how does a country help build an entire industry and then bury almost all of it? The answer isn't that these bikes were bad. A lot of them were brilliant. The answer is a slow-motion pileup of bad timing, bigger enemies, and a couple of decisions that still sting to think about. So, let's walk the rows. It starts in 1901 in Springfield, Massachusetts, with 2 men. George Hendy, a champion bicycle racer, and Oscar Hedstrom, an engineer who could apparently build anything with his hands. Together, they created Indian, one of the first great American motorcycle companies, up and running 2 full years before Harley-Davidson even existed. And Indian was good, fast, reliable, beautifully made. Within a decade, it was the biggest motorcycle manufacturer on the entire planet, shipping bikes out of that red brick Springfield factory by the tens of thousands. And on the racetrack, Indian was terrifying. Their factory team crushed the competition so completely that in 1911, Indian riders traveled all the way to the Isle of Man in Britain, the toughest road race in the world, and swept it. First, second, and third. An American company humbling the Europeans on their own turf. This was a nation that had decided it was going to be great at building fast things with engines. And for a while, it absolutely was. This was the golden age. And the beating heart of it was racing. Not on a smooth modern track like you are picturing, on board tracks. Enormous wooden ovals, banked almost vertical, built out of millions of ordinary 2x4s. Riders in wool sweaters and leather caps circled them at speeds nobody had ever seen on 2 wheels. In 1912, a rider named Lee Humiston took an Excelsior around the boards at Playa del Rey in California and became the first man ever officially clocked at 100 miles an hour on a motorcycle. 100 on wood, with no helmet worth the name and brakes that were mostly a friendly suggestion. The public went wild for it. Though the newspapers had another name for those tracks. They called them the murder-dromes. Riders died. Spectators in the stands died when machines flew off the boards. And the crowds just kept getting bigger. It was dangerous and glorious and completely American. And it could not last. Because the first thing that came for the American motorcycle wasn't another motorcycle, it was a car. In 1908, Henry Ford rolled out the Model T, and over the next few years, he did something nobody thought possible. He made the automobile cheap. Suddenly, the entire reason most working people bought a motorcycle, cheap personal transport, was under threat. A car still cost more than a motorcycle. But Ford narrowed that gap so dramatically that the question changed. Why straddle an engine in the freezing rain when, for a bit more money, you could have 4 wheels, a roof, and a back seat? The numbers told the story. A Model T that cost a small fortune in 1909 cost a fraction of that a decade later, cheap enough that an ordinary family could finally justify one. Against that, a motorcycle that left you soaked, frozen, and unable to carry your kids or your groceries was suddenly a very tough sell. Overnight, the motorcycle stopped being transportation and became a toy, a luxury, a machine for enthusiasts, racers, cops, and daredevils. And that is a much, much smaller market. A smaller market cannot feed 100 companies. So the dying started early, quietly, years before anyone thought to call it a crisis. The weak brands went first. But even some of the strongest were already living on borrowed time. Take Henderson. If you have never heard the name, that silence is exactly the tragedy. In 1912, 2 brothers, William and Tom Henderson, built something that made every other American motorcycle look crude. A bike with a long, elegant inline 4-cylinder engine. So smooth it felt less like riding a machine and more like being pulled along by a very polite hurricane. It was fast, too. Fast enough that police departments all across the country bought Hendersons specifically so they could chase down criminals who were driving cars. And in 1912, a young adventurer named Carl Stearns Clancy took a Henderson and rode it around the entire world, becoming the first person in history to circle the globe by motorcycle. He did it on this bike. This was arguably the finest touring motorcycle in America. So of course, it wasn't allowed to just live in peace. In 1917, the Henderson brothers sold the company to a man named Ignaz Schwinn. Yes, the bicycle Schwinn. Remember that name because he is going to come back into this story, and when he does, he is going to break your heart. William Henderson didn't stick around under new ownership. He left to start yet another 4-cylinder company, this one called Ace. And this is where Henderson's story turns genuinely tragic. At his new company, William Henderson kept doing what he did best, building superb, blisteringly fast 4-cylinder machines. And Ace 4 was one of the quickest bikes money could buy in the early 1920s. But then, while out testing one of his own motorcycles on the road, William Henderson was killed in an accident. The man who had given America 2 of its greatest 4-cylinder brands died riding the very thing he loved to build. Ace struggled on without its founder, changed hands more than once, and was eventually swallowed up by Indian, which turned the design into the Indian 4. So the Henderson bloodline didn't vanish completely, it just got absorbed into a bigger company, with its founder's name slowly fading off the fuel tank. 2 brilliant companies, 1 brilliant man, and today almost nobody remembers any of it. And while the big names fought it out, the rows of the graveyard were quietly filling up. There was Pope. Colonel Albert Pope built an entire manufacturing empire on bicycles and automobiles, and his motorcycles were genuinely excellent, well-engineered and quick, gone by around 1918. There was the Flying Merkel. These were the beautiful ones, painted a bright, unmistakable orange, sold with a slogan promising that all roads were smooth to the man on a Flying Merkel. And here is the wild part. The Flying Merkel had a real suspension system, front and rear, decades before that was anything like normal, ahead of its time and dead by around 1917. There was Thor, which is a special kind of sad, because in the early days Thor actually built engines for Indian. They literally helped power their own future rival and then faded away once that rival grew big enough to build its own. There was Cleveland, which hung on with clever, lightweight machines all the way to 1929. And then there was the Militaire, which I simply have to tell you about because it is gloriously strange. It was a motorcycle that desperately wanted to be a car. 4 cylinders, a steering wheel, wooden artillery wheels like something off a stagecoach, and little outrigger wheels on the side so it would not tip over. It was heavy, hopelessly complicated, and almost nobody bought it. But you have to respect the sheer ambition of building the world's least practical motorcycle and selling it with a completely straight face. There were dozens more that barely got a headstone. Reading Standard out of Pennsylvania, a serious machine that got bought up and quietly shut down. Ivor Johnson, better remembered now for its firearms and bicycles, made solid motorcycles too, and eventually let them go. Yale, Emblem, Dayton, names that were once painted proudly across fuel tanks and are now just faded entries in collectors' record books, if they are remembered at all. Every single one of these was somebody's dream. And most of them were gone before the real disaster even hit. Because by the 1920s, the American motorcycle world had basically narrowed down to a war between two giants, Harley-Davidson and Indian, the big two, with Excelsior hanging on as a distant third. And that war ate everything around it. They fought on price, they fought on the racetrack, and they fought over every dealer in the country. They poured everything into beating each other, and in doing so, they sucked all the oxygen out of the room. This rivalry was personal, and it was relentless. On race day, an Indian beating a Harley, or a Harley beating an Indian, was practically a national event. Fans picked sides the way they picked baseball teams. Both companies spent fortunes on factory race teams chasing records and bragging rights, because in this world, winning on Sunday genuinely sold motorcycles on Monday. It was thrilling to watch, but it was also a trap. Two companies this obsessively locked onto each other had no attention left for the smaller, cleverer competitors quietly going under all around them. And Indian, the older giant, made one decision in this era that you can argue it never truly recovered from. When America entered the First World War, Indian patriotically handed most of its production over to the military, selling tens of thousands of bikes to the government at very little profit. Noble? Absolutely. But while Indian's factory was busy building machines for the army, its dealers back home had almost nothing to sell. So a lot of them started selling Harleys instead, and plenty of them never came back. Indian gave up its own storefront to help win a war, and its biggest rival quietly walked in and took the customers. If you're enjoying this walk through the ruins, do me a quick favor and hit that subscribe button, because this channel is basically a love letter to machines exactly like these. All right, now let's get to the part where the whole thing collapses. In October 1929, the stock market crashed, and the Great Depression rolled over the country like a slow gray tide. And think about what a motorcycle actually is in that moment. It is the definition of something you do not need. When people are losing their homes and their jobs and their savings, nobody is out shopping for a recreational machine. The market didn't just shrink, it very nearly disappeared. The graveyard, which had been filling slowly for 20 years, filled almost overnight. By the middle of the 1930s, the American motorcycle industry had gone from around 100 companies down to a tiny handful. An entire generation of engineering wiped out in the space of a few brutal years. Whole factories went silent. Skilled workers who had spent their whole lives building these machines found that the work simply did not exist anymore. And then comes the moment in this entire story that I still find genuinely hard to sit with. Remember Ignaz Schwinn, the bicycle man who had bought both Excelsior and Henderson? By 1931, he personally owned two of the most respected motorcycle names in America. Excelsior was one of the original big three. Henderson made the smoothest four-cylinder machine in the country. Both were still competitive. Both were still building great bikes. And as the story goes, one ordinary day in 1931, Schwinn walked into a meeting with his motorcycle staff and said 7 words, "Gentlemen, today we stop." And that was it. No slow decline, no bankruptcy auction. With the depression deepening and no end in sight, he decided to pull back to the safer, cheaper bicycle business he knew best. And just like that, he ended it. Excelsior and Henderson, two absolute legends killed in a single afternoon, not beaten in the market, not out-engineered by anybody, just switched off, like a light, by a man who decided motorcycles weren't worth the risk anymore. When the dust finally settled, out of that entire roaring industry, only 2 American giants were left standing, Harley and a wounded Indian. But the single greatest American motorcycle of them all hadn't even been built yet. To understand it, you first have to understand the man behind it. His name was Albert Crocker, He wasn't some faceless corporation. He was an engineer and a businessman who had spent his entire adult life around motorcycles, first working for Aurora, the company behind Thor, and later running an Indian dealership and distributorship out west. He knew these machines down to the bolt. He knew the market, and he had spent years watching the big companies play it safe. So in his 50s, an age when most men are winding down, Albert Crocker decided to risk everything on one wild idea: that America deserved a motorcycle with no compromises at all. Starting around 1936, in a small shop in Los Angeles, Crocker and his tiny team hand-built a big V-twin that was, flat out, faster than anything Harley or Indian was selling. These bikes were quicker, lighter, and made more power, and they were absolutely gorgeous, all long tanks and clean, purposeful lines. Before the road bikes, Crocker had actually made his name building single-cylinder speedway racers for that wild indoor dirt track sport, and they won constantly. That racing DNA went straight into the street twins, and because everyone was built to order, no two Crockers were exactly alike. You could specify your engine size, your finish, your details. You weren't buying a product off an assembly line. You were commissioning a machine from a craftsman. And Albert Crocker knew exactly how good his bikes were. So, according to Crocker legend, he made a promise that riders still talk about today. He offered a money-back guarantee. The story goes that if you bought a Crocker and any stock Harley or Indian could beat it in a race, he would refund your money in full. Think about the confidence buried in that. He was looking at the two biggest companies in the entire country and saying, "My little handmade bike will embarrass your very best, and I will bet the price of the motorcycle on it." And as far as the legend goes, he never once had to pay out. Nobody ever collected. So why isn't Crocker a household name today, right up there with Harley Davidson? Here is the heartbreak. Because those bikes were so good and so completely handmade, Crocker was reportedly losing money on nearly every single one he sold. He was handing over a hand-built masterpiece for less than it cost him to make it, and a tiny shop cannot survive doing that for very long. Then came the knockout blow. World War II. The government's War Production Board needed every scrap of steel and aluminum for the war effort, and civilian motorcycle production for tiny outfits like Crocker's was shut right down. By 1942, it was over. In total, Albert Crocker built barely more than 60 of these big road twins. 60. One of the fastest and most desirable production motorcycles America had ever built, and almost nobody on the entire planet was ever allowed to own one. And here's a detail I love. One of the men working in that little shop, helping build these things, was named Paul Bigsby, who would go on to help shape the entire sound of the electric guitar. That is the level of talent quietly walking through that garage. And that, finally, is why a Crocker rolled across the block at Mecum in Las Vegas in 2025 and sold for $880,000. It's not just a motorcycle. It is one of the rarest and greatest things America ever built, from a company the world barely got the chance to meet before it was gone forever. Which leaves us with the last giant standing, Indian. The company that had started this whole story back in 1901 somehow limped through the Depression and the war, still on its feet, still the great American rival to Harley. And oddly enough, World War II was the best thing that ever happened to the two survivors. The Army suddenly needed motorcycles by the tens of thousands, and Harley and Indian got fat on military contracts, cranking out rugged olive green machines for soldiers all over the world. Harley alone built something like 90,000 of its military bikes, with Indian turning out tens of thousands more. But there were no lifeline contracts for the little guys. The same war that fed the two giants was the war that starved the last independents to death, Crocker very much included. And when peace finally came, only one of those two survivors was truly healthy. because Indian was about to make its final fatal mistakes. After the war, Indian's new management looked across the ocean at the light, nimble British bikes that were suddenly everywhere and decided to chase them. They rushed out a line of smaller, British-style vertical twin engines. Good idea, genuinely terrible execution. The new bikes were unreliable, they broke down constantly, and they hammered whatever was left of Indian's proud reputation at the worst possible moment. But those doomed lightweights were really just the final bad bet, piled on top of years of weak finances, a damaged dealer network, and aging tooling that Indian never had the money to fix. Meanwhile, the actual British machines, Triumph, BSA, and Norton, were pouring into America and doing it properly. And Indian, out of money, out of goodwill, and finally out of time, ran completely out of road. In 1953, the last Indian chief rumbled off the line in Springfield. Picture it for a second. That same red brick factory in Springfield, Massachusetts, the very buildings where George Hendy and Oscar Hedstrom had started all of this back in 1901, now going quiet. The company that had once been the biggest motorcycle maker in the world, that had humbled Europe at the Isle of Man and terrified Harley for half a century, simply stopped. More than 50 years of American history switched off in a factory town that had built its whole identity around those machines. And then, just to make absolutely sure the door was closed, a new wave arrived from across the Pacific. Honda showed up telling America that you meet the nicest people on a Honda, selling cheap, clean, reliable little bikes by the millions. For decades after that, the idea of a great new American motorcycle brand rising up to challenge them felt almost impossible. The graveyard was full, and nobody was building anything new to bury. So let's walk back through the rows one final time. Indian, the pioneer, undone by its own patriotism and a couple of disastrous post-war bets. Henderson and Excelsior, still brilliant, still winning races, switched off in an afternoon by a man who preferred bicycles. Pope, Thor, Cleveland, the beautiful orange Flying Merkel, the gloriously insane Militaire, each one somebody's entire life's work. And Crocker, the greatest of them all, hand-built, unbeatable, and gone before the world ever really got the chance to buy one. Here is the part that gets me about all of it. Almost none of these companies died because their motorcycles were bad. Henderson didn't lose because the four-cylinder was flawed. It was one of the finest engines in the world. Crocker didn't lose because it was slow. It was the fastest thing going, and everyone knew it. They lost to timing, to the Model T, to the Great Depression. To 2 world wars. To a 2-company war that quietly starved everyone else out. And in one case, to a single wealthy man's shrug. Walk that graveyard, and you won't find many failures. You'll find machines that were too good, too early, and backed by far too little money. And maybe that is exactly why a rusty old badge from one of these dead brands can still stop a grown adult in their tracks at a swap meet. Because somewhere in that pile of forgotten names is the ghost of everything American motorcycling could have been. If this one got to you even a little, let me know down in the comments which of these brands you most wish had survived. For me, it will always be Crocker. And if you want more stories about the incredible things people built and then lost, go ahead and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.